Thank you.
Thank you. So can you hear us?
I think they can hear us, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So we might as well start at the beginning.
Yeah.
And climate change is kind of a terrible subject for a novel. Why did you write it, though? What got you into it?
You know, if I can just kind of, get into the numbers a little bit real quick. The number that describes what's going on is the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And 200 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, it was something like 280. A couple hundred years later, when I was born, it was something like 315. So it went up by 35 during those 2 centuries. And during the time I've been alive, it's gone up to something like 418. I haven't checked the website today, so I may be off by, it may be a low figure, but basically, during the time I've been alive, it's gone up by another 100 parts per million after only going up by 35 during the previous 2 centuries. So right now, it's higher than it has been since 15 million years ago when we had a very different planet. But that's all happened in a very short span of time. So to me, this seemed like a just eminently science fictional kind of reality. I mean, kind of our job as science fiction writers is to look at things like this and try to turn them into stories. And so there's plenty of story material in it. We've got the consequences of climate change affecting people all over the world in different ways. And we have a lot of conflict around what we should be doing about it. And it just struck me that a lot of the conversation that was going on kind of misses the point. I think people are both kind of not pessimistic enough and too pessimistic at the same time. Like the situation's a lot more calamitous than even environmentally tuned in people, I think, tend to acknowledge. But I think that there's something we can do about it in the next century, which is to extract carbon from the atmosphere on a really large scale. So that's not what the book is about. The book's about somebody doing something much more short-term. That's more of a temporary band-aid solution, which is solar geoengineering.
So one of the things that, in fact, Amitav Ghosh wrote a whole book about this, The Great Derangement, which is that when you hear these things that the carbon level is higher than it's been in 15 million years and the entire global industrial system is contributing to it, it leads to a kind of paralysis.
Yeah.
And it's pretty easy to find people who feel like we're all doomed and see every new little evidence of something from climate change as that. Your book is kind of the opposite. You see it as it's kind of projecting it as a solvable problem.
So the character in the book is doing a thing called solar radiation management. There's a bunch of people keep rapidly mutating the word because it's so controversial that words become unsayable and get.
Every time they're mentioned, there's a Twitter onslaught.
Yeah. But the idea is, as I said, it's a band-aid. It's a temporary solution that some people have proposed to put a veil of reflective material in the stratosphere that would bounce back a fraction of the sun's rays and keep that radiation from warming up the atmosphere. Doesn't get to the underlying problem, but could be a sort of temporary tourniquet,
You probably should say that there's clear evidence that this would work in some fashion.
Well, that's what makes it interesting, is that there have been, as you know, many instances throughout human history of volcanic eruptions performing this experiment for us naturally by putting plumes of sulfur dioxide containing material into the stratosphere. And we almost had one in Tonga a few weeks ago, but it wasn't quite big enough to make much of a difference. The most recent one that did make a difference and that could be measured in a scientific way was Pinatubo in 1991. And that's, I think, if I can go for the really cheap pun, that was sort of the big bang of a lot of the thinking around this idea.
And one of the things that's sort of both attractive and alarming to people about this is that it's actually incredibly cheap. In the standard, you can, an eccentric rich person, a single one, can have a measurable effect on the global climate.
Yeah, the premise of the book is that somebody does exactly that. And I decided to have it be an individual Texas billionaire instead of a nation state because I thought that would make for a better story. But in reality, I think if it happens, it'll be a nation state or somebody within another nation state who's so integrated with the power structure that they might as well be the.
So the idea is that you have Malaysia or some very wealthy person in Malaysia doing a kind of green finger number and just sending up huge amounts of sulfur into the atmosphere that turns into sulfur dioxide that turns into tiny little glittering droplets that bounce back 10 or 15% of the sun's radiation, dropping temperature by a degree or two.
Right. And this is an idea that came up yesterday when you and I were talking about it, is the notion that when we think of billionaires, we tend to think of the Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk kind of billionaires, but there's lots of billionaires that we've never heard of in a lot of them in parts of the world that are going to suffer from the effects of climate change a lot more severely than the United States will. Places with low-lying areas where sea level rise is going to be devastating, and hot places where they're susceptible to a kind of disaster that's called a wet bulb disaster, which basically means that both the temperature and the humidity get so high at the same time that humans can't remain alive unless they're protected. It's a scenario that is described very powerfully in the first chapter of Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry for the Future. So if you're an important person with power and money in a place like that, I don't see why you wouldn't consider doing this. But again, that's not the book that I wrote. It's a guy in Texas.
A truck stop billionaire.
Yeah, a truck stop billionaire who a lot of his family fortune came from oil, gas, mining. So he's kind of paying the piper, if you will.
And one of the things that I think this book ties into is sort of a general theme of your work is we don't build big things anymore. Or if failure, you've talked about this, in the Project Hieroglyph, you talked about this in your article about innovation starvation, and your books are full of big engineering projects. And so in a certain way, there's a continuity here with Neal proposing another big engineering project.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's a staple of science fiction to have such things. Of course, not all science fiction, but kind of hard SF. And this kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about being too pessimistic. Is that this problem of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is essentially just a huge engineering project, and it's not, it's difficult because of its hugeness, but it's not otherwise difficult. It'll be the biggest engineering project in human history, I hope, and it might take 100 years, but eventually it's going to get the CO2 level back down to where it should be, and kind of settle this problem for good. But it's a hard thing for so environmentally conscious people to I think get behind, because it's an approach to attacking this problem that's essentially about building gigantic factories. unlike the factories we're used to, these wouldn't be spewing fumes into the air or toxic waste. They'd be just essentially shitting out huge bricks of carbon day in and day out for decades. But nonetheless, they would be big, gigantic industrial complexes. And there's sort of a thing in environmental thinking that goes against the grain of that pretty strongly.
Well, I think there's also has to do with the roots of, this is part of what I wrote that book about, is the roots of environmental thought. And there's a kind of deeply Christian viewpoint that there's this wonderful early state that we need to return to.
Yeah, and then there's a kind of arc of redemption that is it's a narrative that's really easy for people from a kind of Christian tradition to latch onto, which is that you're a damned sinner, you don't know it, you become aware that you're sinning, you feel bad, you repent, in a public way, you come to Jesus, you change your life, and you are redeemed. And that's a kind of satisfying narrative arc for one's journey, and I think it accounts for a lot of the ways that people sort of process environmentalism in their day-to-day lives. It might be fine as a moral precept in general, I don't know, but it's not going to help get megatons or gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere. We need giant factories for that.
It's also sort of deeply culturally bound
Yeah.
in the sense that you get reminded of that if you frequently, I've done writing a book now that involves talking to a lot of indigenous people, and just a few days ago I was in British Columbia talking to the Department of Natural Resources for one of the nations there, and they've had a lot of damage from logging.
An indigenous nation, not Canada per se, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Tlaukiote. And they, so I said, oh, you're trying to, restore nature. And he said, essentially, hell no. We don't want nature. We want abundance.
He looked at you like you were...
Yeah, like I was an idiot.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I was being. And he said, look, we like clam beaches. And if you have a natural clam beach, you get X number of clams. But we tinker around with it. We move the sand around, and we get 4 or 5 times as many clams. That's what we want. We don't want a natural state. We want a better state.
And they, not just they, but other indigenous
Oh yeah, no,
groups
it's
have been
extremely
doing that
common.
for-
We kind of tend to look at, in my view, we have this mythical past, the wilderness before humans sullied it,
Yeah.
and we're trying to bring it back. And they, it's a gross generalization. You're dealing with thousands of different types of cultures, but very, very often you encounter people sort of saying, no, let's think of the future we want, and how do we get there?
Yeah.
And
So
that's a more useful way of thinking about it, in my view.
controlled burning of
Yeah.
of certain foliage to engineer the environment that you
Right.
want is
That would be the Great Plains.
yeah.
Yeah, the
Right,
Great
so
Plains, which were 40% bigger, than they would be naturally, because people burn them.
Right,
that
burn
kind of
them
stuff.
back because then you get grassland and then you get grazing animals that are good to eat.
Right. So that kind of attitude is, in a certain weird way, is what your Texas billionaire is
Yeah.
connected to.
And there's even there's a bit in, I can't remember if it's 1491 or 93, but that there was a mini ice age during a certain period in I think it was the 1600s, that may have been caused by carbon uptake.
Right, a cessation of indigenous burning all across the Americas due to the fact that European diseases killed them off. And so you had this ecological convulsion.
So there's this Holocaust in the Americas caused by diseases just killing shocking numbers of people, and that drives down their normal activities to the point where the forests that they've been keeping at bay begin to grow back. They begin to fix carbon out of the atmosphere, and we get...
So this is a form of geoengineering.
Yeah.
So in a way, I'd push back at you and say, when you talk about factories, we also have to remember that there's all kinds of things that are factories. There's lots of people attempting to engineer carbon-eating crops. so that you would transform rice from a C3 crop, which doesn't grow particularly fast, to a C4 crop, which is a faster form of photosynthesis. And this would, if done on a large scale all around the world, would have enormous impacts on how much carbon is sequestered.
Right, so it doesn't look like a factory, and yet is
A radical transformation on a large scale.
is equally alarming, maybe
Right.
even more so, to a lot of environmentalists of the traditional stripe, because at some level, if you're that way, it's even creepier than just having a factory.
Right. But there's also, and I think that you've talked about this kind of thing in terms of a failure of imagination, that there's, to a certain extent, we've learned that just going ahead and doing stuff can have bad consequences. But it's as if we've overlearned that lesson.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the what's kind of been written into law and sort of institutionalized literally in a lot of governmental agencies and environmental groups is the precautionary principle, which sort of comes out of some seriously bad things that happened, largely in the post-war era. So, we had DDT, which seemed great because it's really good at killing bugs and probably saved a lot of lives by driving down insect-borne diseases, but it turned out to have this side effect that was just devastating to bird populations. And so that was an example of, hey, wait a second, before we go releasing chemicals into the environment, we need to make sure that they're not going to have these sort of hard to foresee knock-on effects. And the only way to figure that out is to do some pretty elaborate and slow studies. Nuclear power seemed like an awesome idea. A lot of the early generation of nuclear power plants were sort of kind of rushed into service, and so we had negative consequences from that and from the fact that we didn't really have a good way to deal with the nuclear waste. So a whole series of those kind of led to the enshrinement of the precautionary principle, which is there for good reasons, but I don't think it's helping us right now dealing with this just kind of shocking emergency of CO2.
So the house is on fire, and
Yeah.
so maybe the precautionary principle isn't the way to approach putting it out?
Yeah. So anyway, it's all from sort of getting back to my position in the world as a novelist, a storyteller. When I see something like this, with all these dimensions to it and all of these conflicts and different points of view, to me, that's just evidence that there's stories to be told there, because there's all the drama, all the danger, all the conflict is just there, kind of waiting to be worked with.
So at the same time, you're talking about the house is on fire, yet it also seems, a thing that sort of, maybe it's a pet peeve of mine, we've failed to acknowledge how much progress we've actually made already in doing this.
In addressing...
in addressing climate change.
Yeah. So I think you're better informed on that than I am, but do you want to talk about the IPCC stuff?
Yeah, okay. I guess this is maybe appropriate for me to talk about since I'm a journalist, and journalists have been partly responsible for the sort of feeling that we're all doomed. So this kind of gets into the weeds, but the way the IPCC, which I assume you guys know what it is the international body that tries to assess where we are at, has done things for a long time is in terms of what they call representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, and these are these models of what might happen at given carbon levels. And in the early 90s, when this process was set up, there was this RCP 8.5, which was kind of where we were heading. And that is, let me make sure I got this right, it's 8.5 watts of solar radiation per square meter, as a result of climate change. And that would be really, really terrible. By 2100, it leads to a temperature rise of, roughly speaking, between 3 and 5.5 degrees C. And that was business as usual. Well, since then, things have changed, and would require, to get to RCP 8.5, would require us to burn about 10 times as much coal as we are now burning, which I just think is not going to happen. And so it's much more like an RCP 4.5, which gets you to, somewhere around 3 degrees C, way too
So we would have to multiply our current coal burning rate worldwide by 10.
10 to get to
In order to have that worst, that most pessimistic scenario actually be realized.
Yeah. And that's just very unlikely to happen, and for a whole host of reasons. And so we're now looking at a 3-degree future, still way, way too high.
Yeah.
Really bad, but considerably better than 5.5 degrees.
Right.
And the point is that I feel, is that there's much too much stuff. If you look at these headlines from studies that are in the newspapers, they're almost always generated by people using the RCP 8.5 projection. This is sort of inside baseball. But current IPCC report, which was greeted by headlines about these catastrophes, is almost all plucked from the part where they talk about this one particular model that is no longer realistic.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what happens to the carbon, because I think that's a frequently misunderstood part of this. A lot of the efforts that we've been engaged in to try to address this problem are about bringing down the rate at which we put more CO2 into the atmosphere, and that is slowly beginning to take effect. I mean, most of the time I've been alive, it's been going up by about 1.6, 1.7 parts per million a year, and that is still the case, but it's starting to slow down a little bit. So maybe, in a few years it'll be going up by only 1.5 or 1.2 parts per million a year, but it's still going up. The graph is still climbing.
And it's partly because that the graph is still climbing, even though we've gotten better, is because places like China have industrialized, and that's a good thing, that huge numbers of people now have electricity that didn't have it. So
it's hard to go to places like that and say, stop giving electricity to your people.
Right. And they've done it in a much less carbon, than we did. They put up a much less carbon into the air per capita industrializing than we did in the early 20th century. So it's even harder to do that because they're doing a better job than we did.
Right. So, if we do level off and become carbon neutral, so I think China is saying now that by 2060 they plan to be carbon neutral, meaning that 40 years from now China won't be adding to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere anymore. And I think ExxonMobil has made a similar claim in 2050. So 30 years from now, we won't be adding more CO2.
And even India. I mean, India is so dependent on coal that there's actually a ministry of coal in the cabinet. There's a secretary of coal.
A cabinet member.
A cabinet member, yeah.
Just the coal.
Right. It gives you some idea of how embedded coal is, and they have actually recently promised, I think it's 2060. So that's great, right?
That's great, and so you don't want to ever criticize that or say it's not great, but if all that happens, and let's say that by that point the CO2 level is close to 500 parts per million, it will then stay there forever. I mean, practically forever.
In practical terms, you mean?
Yeah, it's nature has ways of taking this stuff out of the atmosphere, but it would take hundreds of thousands of years for natural processes to extract that carbon back from the atmosphere and sequester it back in, where we took it from.
Right.
Coal, peat bogs and forests and coal mines and so on. So if we do achieve those goals, which is a great thing to do, we're still going to be stuck with these incredibly high levels of carbon in the atmosphere that are not really compatible with having a stable ecosystem. And so at that point, you know, we're kind of out of ideas until we begin to remove carbon and to do so on an incredibly gigantic scale.
It's actually, so that's the downside. It's actually even worse than that because when you take it out of the atmosphere, the ocean, which has done us the favor of absorbing a huge amount of carbon dioxide, immediately starts outgassing it.
Right. It's actually, if you do the math just on the carbon that's in the atmosphere, you're only seeing about half of it because there's this obviously huge interface between the atmosphere and the surface of the ocean. And just like carbonated beverages, you get not that fizzy, but the ocean gets a little bit fizzy with carbon dioxide that it's pulled out of the atmosphere. And as you say, when we extract it from the atmosphere, it comes out. So so there's even more that needs to be sequestered than a simple calculation would indicate.
And then there's always the possibility of surprises. You know, even though when we say we think we'll level off at 3 degrees, we don't actually know what that means.
Yeah, there may be weird things that happen with you know, frozen methane on the floor of the ocean that could boil up, or sinks in the permafrost. Kind of weird interactions that we don't know about yet. But I mean, the upshot of it is that we're going to have to do carbon capture no matter what, and so you know, we need to turn some of our engineering talents in that direction. And I'm beginning, I think, to see some of this. I'm beginning to see some of the kinds of techies and tech investors and so on who 10, 20 years ago would have been solely focused on internet stuff or other kinds of tech projects, kind of turning their attention towards towards carbon. And it's small, but it seems to be growing.
So what kind of, when you talk about that, you know, it is a giant engineering problem. How does it work? You know, what is the problem?
There are a number of different ways of doing it, and I guess the good news is that it's such a big project that we need all of those ways and more. But the first and most challenging aspect of it is, though, it's this weird irony that although the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is extremely high by global historical standards, and is really making a big difference in the climate, it's still maddeningly diluted. So these numbers I'm talking about, 418 parts per million or whatever, that kind of tells you right there that that this stuff is present in very dilute form. So you have to find processes that can selectively pull this gas out of the air in a very targeted way. And obviously plants are capable of doing it. That's how plants survive. So they have, you can just use plants, or you can genetically engineer plants, or you could try to sort of, in a test tube, copy the processes that plants use, or you can go with more direct kind of chemical processes that just selectively grab CO2 out of the air.
So one of the things that your book is about the fact that when people start to do this kind of thing, it freaks other people out.
Yeah.
For a whole host of reasons. Because climate change is winners and losers. You know, there's
sure.
itself, and because almost any of these solutions will generate winners and losers.
Yeah, so and again, the book is about this Band-Aid approach, but a lot of the same arguments can be made about carbon capture. You know, even if you pick, let's say you pick kind of the most benign sounding approach you can think of to all of this, which would be to plant lots of trees. So you plant lots of trees, and they grow and they pull carbon out of the air while they're doing it. Well, to make a difference, you're going to have to plant trees over a vast area. A few trees here and there isn't going to do it. And at that point, you are geoengineering. So the mere existence of those trees is changing the albedo of the land in a certain area. That's going to change the way that the atmosphere moves, convection, transpiration. They're going to extract water out of the ground. And it sounds great, lots of forests. We all have sort of, happy associations with forests. But there's always someone who's going to experience some kind of a negative impact from even something as benign sounding as that.
Well, especially when you consider that the areas in which you can plant large numbers of trees in which there aren't already large numbers of trees is not that limited. And usually they're either going to be agricultural land, or urban land or something, which people aren't going to be that happy about, or else you're going to do something like reforest the Sahara, which you could do 3,000 years ago or whatever. It was covered with trees.
It was covered with trees, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then you're doing pretty significant changes.
Yeah, you're meddling. There may be somebody downwind of there that that experiences a drought or some other kind of repercussion based on that.
In your book, you point to one of the obvious things that people would freak out about, which is the monsoon, which is a huge deal in Asia, which is one of the most populous and economically dynamic parts of the planet, but is entirely dependent on this natural rain cycle.
Yeah, so there are some cases when you're writing a book where just going for the most obvious and simple thing is the right approach. And so when I was trying to think about the possible negative impacts of something like this and who would be affected, I initially thought that the monsoon was too obvious, but the more I thought about it, I thought, well, of course that would be, the important thing to look at. So the monsoon turns out to be this fabulously complex interaction of the the albedo of the snow on the Himalayas and the changing of wind patterns, during different times of the year. And most of the time it works. Sometimes it works too well and there's too much rain, and that's bad, and people suffer and die because of floods. And other times it doesn't happen, doesn't come off for whatever reason, and then there's drought and people suffer and die because of that. So it's this fairly stable and yet delicate mechanism on which many lives depend. So
it's pretty hard to imagine how a large-scale program to artificially alter the climate wouldn't have some impact. Yeah.
Right, because there's so many factors that enter into the monsoon. So it's a given that even if you instituted some kind of program to deal with the climate, and it was provably not affecting the monsoon at all, people are going to assume that it is.
Well, it's pretty easy for me to put myself in the shoes of the Indian government and say, you say it's not going to affect.
Right, easy for you to say.
Right.
Running your geoengineering plant in the United States, but this is a national security issue for us. Maybe not in the sense of being invaded or attacked, but potentially even more devastating than a military invasion. And so
it's hard to imagine the U.S. would be entirely thrilled about an Indian geoengineering thing that had really negative effects on the El Nino cycle for the Western United States.
Or even that could be perceived or construed as doing so, because it's going to be used as a political crowbar by someone. Mm-hmm. And so so yeah, that's you know, that's kind of the it's a devilish problem if you want to actually implement something like this, but it's just it's great material for
a rollicking good tale.
yeah for a techno thriller. And so what I was trying to do in the book was to try to present a balanced portrayal of that, and to the extent that some people fight back in the book against the plans of this billionaire, they're not doing it in an unreasonable way, or you know, they're essentially just looking to their own national security in a certain way.
Which is, you know, part of the definition of the problem, that you're dealing with a global problem, but it's not anywhere close to a unified global response.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and there never will be. I mean, so and one of the things that we're hung up on is waiting for global unity to you know, arrive at some consensus on what to do, and that's going to be a long wait.
I mean, by waiting for global unity and world peace, is, you know, the proxy for that is all these giant international accords, the Paris Accord, the, you know, one in Brazil, you know, in the 90s, that the Tokyo Accord, that kind of thing.
So we got some questions.
You're right. Since we've finished with the impossibility of world peace.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And move on to other.
Do you want to pick a few, or?
Yeah, let's see. How do you think literature can help to build desirable futures? Well, it's tricky because I don't think anyone likes to feel like they're being lectured to or sermonized when they're trying to enjoy a work of entertainment, which is what a novel is. And so I tend to shy away from any kind of instrumental view of art, because as soon as you try to use it as an instrument to achieve a certain goal, you've become somebody's instrument. I think it's got to be pretty indirect, and it's got to be just sticking to the imperative of telling good stories, and if you can bring some insights into a subject matter that are interesting to people, and give them some new ideas, then hopefully that can exert influence without seeming to push people around, if that makes any.
So you can't know this, but they've presented all these questions here, and a significant minority of them are about the Metaverse, which is nothing to do with climate change, but obviously there's some interest in hearing that. Do you want to just deal with all the Metaverse questions?
Deal with the Metaverse thing?
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is off topic. I mean, I see the word.
Sorry, I know.
No, I see the word everywhere here at South by. So
you have a lot to answer for. That's all I got to say.
I know. Look, it's been the people in the tech world have been using it for a while, and what happened late last year is that it went wide very rapidly and very suddenly because of a series of announcements, and so now it's kind of the buzzword, and I don't know how long that'll last, but you know, I guess a couple of observations. One is that if you're shopping for metaverses or metaverse solutions, you might ask yourself, how are these people making money? Because if they're making money by selling your clicks and your engagement the way social media companies do it, then you can expect a lot more of what we already get from social media with all of the concomitant impacts on our politics and our society. So that's an important thing, I think, to keep your eye on. And then just the other thing is that in a lot of ways, I think what people really mean when they talk about the metaverse is, what are you going to be buying 5 years from now? Because we've probably gone about as far as we can go with rectangles with pixels on them. I mean, not that they're not going to keep getting better, but like I've got a TV in my house that the pixels are smaller than I can resolve with my eye. So if the pixels got half as big and 4 times as many of them, it wouldn't really improve my life. And that's true in a lot of areas right now. So I think people who make hardware and software are naturally asking themselves, what's the business plan for the next 5 years? And metaverse has become something of an umbrella term for a suite of hardware and software that they hope people will be enjoying and paying for a few years down the road.
Is it necessary to say that you're not involved in the Facebook?
Well, I said that on Twitter, and that's true. Yeah, I'm not, yes, I'm not involved in Facebook.
So that's it for Metaverse, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the question here says, could it lead to an economic division between rich and poor, which I'm going to interpret to mean, could it make that worse? I mean, anything could. I don't know if the metaverse is uniquely dangerous in that way. When I can remember being on stage at Harvard 25 years ago or something, being asked the same question about the internet. And we still have rich and poor people. I don't think that it's that kind of technology determines richness and poorness. I think we have to look to other causes.
So how about this top question here? How do you get politicians to think long-term enough to invest in sequestration? Or if looking to the private sector, how do you make a profit?
Well, I think it's impossible to get politicians by their nature to think that far in the future. It's just not going to ever happen. And so, I mean, I wish it were possible, and if someone knows how to do it, then I'm all ears. But the election cycles only last a few years, and that's too short. So some kind of economic incentive is going to be the only way, I think, to get people to invest in carbon sequestration on a large scale.
So you don't think, like the Interstate Highway Program, which is a 40-year construction program, which was...
Well, there you go with your facts. Good point. Excellent point.
Well, there was because that was presented as national security.
It was.
So, and this is national security. I mean, it actually is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. If you can get people to buy into the idea that it's a security thing, then, and the other great thing about that program was lots of jobs.
Yeah.
Distributed all over the country, not just focused. I mean, by its nature.
So if you build giant carbon factories, you know, there's plenty of goodies.
Like the space program, sort of grew to the extent that, I mean, if you could get a space program related factory in every congressional district, then it's locked in.
Well, Texas actually had an example of this with the super collider that everybody in Congress was totally ready to go for until they actually selected where it was going to go, and then the other 49 states said no.
Yeah, right.
So this has the merit of having to be everywhere.
Yeah, or the Johnson Space Center in Houston. It's like, you're going to put it where? But that's where it went, and so
Well, that's because of LBJ, presumably. Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
So.
So there may be some attempt.
Yeah, I like your analogy of the highway system. I think if the money is spent locally, if it's distributed all over the country, not just isolated in a few places, and it sort of comes to be understood and accepted as a national security thing, then which it is, then maybe that's the ticket.
So one question here is basically saying, what is COVID-19 and the world's response? You know, what does that make you think about how we might respond to another global emergency, i.e. climate change?
That was really an interesting thing to watch because it was simultaneously so good and so bad. You know, I mean, the development of mRNA vaccines in this incredibly short period of time was just a miracle.
I am one of the people who said it would be impossible to develop a vaccine in less than 10 years. I was wrong, totally wrong, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's never been done before.
Right, right. And it was a new way of doing it, and just amazing result there, combined with, you know, politicization and a refusal to accept that it was even real, that is still true of a lot of people, and you know, mega deaths.
And then there's sort of a weird amount of bungling in the places like the CDC and so forth that was a real surprise to me.
Yeah, yeah, but heroes in some, so like the lab at the University of Washington,
right.
You know, where a lot got done in a short time by, I can't remember the woman's name, sadly, but you know, she's going to be in a movie someday.
Right. So there's this weird mixture of catastrophic and amazing that characterizes the rest of human history.
Yeah, well said. So yeah, I mean, I guess the only general note maybe to draw from it is that the more weird stuff like that happens, the more it tends to shatter existing sort of congealed hierarchies, I mean that can have a downside, but it can have an upside too.
So when you think about climate change, actually, you know, living in Seattle, what is sort of your personal, what makes you anxious personally? I think when you think about it, there's just a question for me, not on there here. There's just looking at some of these questions are all about anxieties of one sort or another.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've got one about blockchain. Will blockchain screw over the planet? Do you think
What I meant, the sort of generalized free-floating anxiety attached to these words here. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, free-floating anxiety is a sort of relatively, I mean, it's bad, but it looks a lot less bad when you look at the Ukraine, right? So you know, we can be anxious about things, and people frequently are, and
look at that. Actually, the bottom one. What scares you about our future? There
yeah,
it is.
yeah. But then you know, when truly disastrous things happen, like that invasion, it puts everything in perspective, sadly.
So there's asking you about winners and losers from climate change, and who are they, and how will geopolitics affect and be affected by climate issues? We talked about that a little bit, but there seems like there's more room for that. That's the second one.
Yeah, let me just hit the blockchain thing. Just
okay.
It's important to keep in mind that there's a bunch of different ones, and old school Bitcoin is indeed very energy intensive and uses a lot of electricity, and so that is a true thing. But there's a lot of ferment going on in that area, and people looking at ways to make new chains and new currencies that have a minimal impact, and to the extent they do have an impact, you can some of them are just buying carbon credits to offset their carbon footprint.
So this relates to something we were actually talking about earlier, which is there's this tendency when you talk about mechanisms to offset, like carbon credits, immediately there's a criticism, and which is that the carbon credits are not being done in the right way.
Right. Oh, they're planting trees, but they're planting the wrong trees, or they're planting them in the wrong places, and so there is, it just goes back to that kind of ossified mindset in a lot of traditional environmentalism that isn't functional in today's world.
In which way not functional? I mean, because it's often
well, I
effective.
mean, like there was a similar thing just a couple of weeks ago, there was a power line project that was going to bring power down into your neck of the woods from in Massachusetts from hydro facilities in Quebec, where there's a lot of hydro. So by any measure, it's exactly the kind of thing we should be investing in to get energy without carbon. But it was shot down by environmental groups who are focused on more the kind of property values, it's going to spoil my view style of environmentalism.
So there's sort of an unholy alliance rather between environmentalism and NIMBYism in that way?
Well, yeah, I mean, and the other thing is that because of the opening scene in the book, I've become like the central repository of all internet memes about wild swine. And so anytime there's a story about wild hogs anywhere, it shows up in my inbox. And there's a whole controversy in California now where this has become a huge problem that to Texans is totally familiar, but it's somewhat new there, and it's eradicating these invasive animals is controversial there. It's the environmental kind of mentality kicks in, and it's like, oh, well, how can we we should let them live in harmony with nature kind of thing, which pigs are not very good at. So
they're engineers of their own way, which is incredibly good at turning up vast quantities of soil and rooting out everything that's in it.
Yeah. So what else we got?
Talk about performative war as a big part of Termination Shock.
Yeah, so the idea of performative war it's a very old idea that you see in old sagas and old epics, and you see it here in Texas. It was a practice of the Comanches and some other tribes, where it's a very reasonable thing in some ways, which is instead of just people en masse killing each other, you pick two champions and have them fight each other. It came up yesterday when Elon Musk challenged Vladimir Putin to single combat. And so that's a type of performative war, but sort of the gist of it is that rather than the kind of classic 20th century technocratic war where it's all about just maximizing your control of ground, you're kind of doing things in a warlike setting for their psychological effect, for their spiritual impact. So it's always been a thing that has been practiced in a lot of cultures, in different ways, and in some ways it's like a lot more reasonable than, World War I.
Sure. No, when I was in Wyoming, I found out that the Shoshone there in the Wind River Reservation had proposed that instead of there being this massive Indian war, that Waukesha, the leader, would just simply fight the current U.S. president. And so I then went to a military base and I talked about it with the soldiers. And I did not find a single soldier who thought this was a terrible idea.
Well, I think Iron Jacket was a Comanche leader who he had an old Spanish breastplate or some piece of armor, which is where he got his name. But somewhere around here, he proposed that to one of the white military guys who was out after him, and it didn't work.
But part of that also performative war is showing that you're a total badass.
Yeah.
And so, Europeans did this where they would, have, when you went into London, the London cops would have, dead bodies hanging around at the entrances and, heads and so forth to tell you this is the kind of territory you're going and keep your nose clean, which is all part of that same sort of thing, I think, to do something by show so you don't actually have to have huge numbers of people slaughtering each other in the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate purpose of most combat is to break the opponent's will to keep fighting, and there's a bunch of ways to do that. And if it in World War I, it kind of reached that's the ultimate example of we're just going to slaughter each other until someone stops, someone cries uncle. But there's other ways to do it, and most of them are more efficient in human lives than kind of 20th century warfare. You see it in the Ukraine, right?
Right. So maybe the top question for the last one. What technology do you view as a hopeful sign of the future? We have 33 seconds.
I just this may be my imagination running away with me, but I feel like I'm starting to see techies who 5-10 years ago would have been obsessed with writing apps or starting internet startups, turning their attention towards engineering solutions to climate change and particularly to carbon capture. So I hope I'm not just imagining that. I hope that's what happens.
Thank you guys for coming.
Yeah, thanks.